Okay, let's do it.
Hi, everyone. My clock says it's 6 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Scott Johnson with the Jackson County Historical Society. I am the person that's responsible for putting these programs together. So if anything doesn't seem right, I guess I'm the guy you can throw tomatoes at. I'm really happy to present Erica Holst from the Illinois State Museum. Give us, as you all know, a presentation over that. I'm going to turn it over to her because she's got a lot more interesting things to say than I do.
Neat. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for everybody who's here in the room and tuning in tonight. I'm going to be talking to you about the life cycle of clothing. And this talk came about because of an exhibit we had about 4 years ago at the Illinois State Museum called Fashioning Illinois 1820 to 1900. This was the first time that the Illinois State Museum, where I work, had put a display on of its historic clothing collection. And initially, the exhibit was just supposed to get these garments out in front of people so we could see them and enjoy them. But as we started doing research into them, we were really struck by the nature of how making and mending and caring for clothes has changed so much since the 19th, well into the 20th century to where we are today. And so this talk grew out of that, and this talk is an exploration of the way that we used to be with clothes and the effort that people used to put into keeping themselves clothed on a daily basis. Before I dive in, I just want to give a plug to my home institution, the Illinois State Museum. Has anyone been there by any chance? Oh, great, cool, neat. Well, thank you to those of you who've been. To the rest of you, if you ever find yourself in Springfield with some time to kill, I hope you'll stop by. We're right by the state capitol. That's actually like the little tip of the Capitol dome you can see over the museum. And we're open 7 days a week with free admission. We're currently closed at this moment because we're having a major plumbing overhaul, but that's supposed to be done in November and we'll be back open. And I'm the curator of history at the museum. And just what does a curator of history do? It's a pretty cool job. I work a lot with historic objects. I help to grow our collection of historic objects. Currently, we've got about 20,000 in our collection. I help to display them in exhibits. I give talks like these. I help with educational programs. So my job is to share the cool stuff that the museum has with the public in any way possible. My favorite objects, I just want to dive a little bit into this too, because I often get asked what's my favorite object in the collection, and it's a little bit like, picking your favorite child. But if you had to pin me down, we got a collection of garments that belonged to that woman there. Her name was Caroline Sutherland. And so she was born and raised in the state of New York. In 1856, she got married to a man who brought her to Rockford, Illinois. And within the span of that year, 1856 to 1857, she got married, moved to Illinois, got pregnant, delivered a baby girl. Sadly, that baby girl died after 2 weeks, so she buried the child. And then Caroline herself died 1 year to the day after her wedding. And the donation of clothes that we got is from that last year of her life. And in things like her a nightgown that she wore when she was pregnant, or that's a pair of her drawers that's been extended with like a little piece of string to accommodate her pregnancy. You see her going from bride to someone moving across the country to expectant mother to new mother to bereaved mother to having died herself, and it's just such a powerful arc for a story that's very common, but we don't really memorialize it in history. How many women are there that died in childbirth and wind up just as a little footnote in history? And so I like how this kind of rescues her at least a little bit and kind of puts a face to a name and gives us a little bit of her story. If anyone has anything that they feel has a cool story, I don't want to compete with the Historical Society, but we are always looking to expand the collection. So if you've got something with a connection to Illinois and a cool story, let me know. I'd love to hear about it. And then moving on to what we came here for is to talk about clothing. The first question I want to pose is, where did the clothes that you have on come from? Does anyone happen to know, either remember where you bought it or know like the country where it was manufactured? Bangladesh, yeah, that's a big one, yeah. Oh yeah, where are those made? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Um, Made in Japan. Well, if I had asked you that question, as early as 100 years ago, more than that, you would have said that you made it, or you knew the name of the person who made it, because throughout the 18th century and for most of the 19th century and actually well into the 20th century, clothing was made for somebody, not anybody. So that's our first difference between the past and today. Today, you kind of generally know what size you are. I'm a like size medium top, so I can go get something off the rack and be pretty certain it'll fit. Back then, especially for women, clothing was handmade and had often a very precise fit. And we ran into this challenge when we were staging that fashioning exhibit, because each one of those dresses is very individualized. Each woman has a different waist measurement and, bust measurement and hip measurement, and we didn't have the budget for the fancy, custom made mannequins that cost $2,000 a piece. We had $100 per mannequin, so I got the styrofoam specials off of Etsy, and I had to take an electric knife to, shave them down, because the women were so tiny that, the mannequins were still too big for the clothes. But then I had to kind of pad them back out. I used poly batting to, give them kind of hips or a bust to make them fit the garment, because, we sure weren't going to alter the garment to fit the mannequin. So in the 19th century, and again, well into the 20th century, all women knew how to sew. This was considered a life skill, to such a degree that there was a women's advice manual that said something to the effect of, a woman who doesn't know how to sew is as deficient in her education as a man who cannot write. And I just want to ask quickly here, how many people can sew in this room? Nice. Awesome. Many years ago. So we're right at the point in living memory where the ability, the universal ability of women to sew has dropped off in living memory. For me, it was my mom's generation. She was brought up knowing how to sew and to knit, and she would make, or she would tweak her own clothes. And she didn't teach me, and I had no desire to learn. And so that's it. Those skills stop with me, and I just don't have them. And sometimes I think back about how many generations and generations and generations of passed down knowledge that literally stopped. And now I would say that there's probably a little bit of a resurgence with younger people too, which is kind of cool to see. People are getting into sewing and they're getting into mending again. But there's definitely a time in the 20th century when, the store-bought clothes kind of peaked, and there was a big shift away from homemade clothes and things. So if you were a girl, you would be taught to sew, generally by a female relative, mom, grandma, sister, aunt. Someone at home would put a needle in your hand, probably at a very young age, and get you sewing. And pretty soon you'd be helping out with kind of the family tasks of mending or, hemming things, kind of the basic stuff. And what you're looking at on your right is a darning sampler. So this is a girl's kind of, it's almost like her final exam, like all the stitches that you would need to master kind of like plain sewing in a household. It's got pleats, it's got ruffles, it's got hook and eye hooks, it's got buttons, it's got tucks to grow, it's got a patch, it's got a darn. This is all the things that kind of keep a household going and clothed. If you were a more affluent girl, you might be sent to a girls' school. And this is kind of hit or miss, especially before the Civil War, before public education became a thing. If a family had to pay to educate their children, and if your means were limited and there's, sons and daughters in the household, it's the sons that are going to get the education. if a family did educate their daughters, one of the most standard things that they would take home from their schooling was a fancier sampler like that. That's an embroidery sampler. So it's got, nicer embroidery stitches in it. Generally, you also see like the alphabet, you see a run of numbers and letters, you might see like a Bible verse or something. And it's both like, a certificate of having accomplished learning the lessons, learning math and reading and everything, and also having mastered these embroidery stitches. And so families literally would hang them in the house because they're attractive to look at, but it was a signal to visitors like, hey, we're doing well enough that we spared one of our daughters from the housework, paid to have her sent off to school, and now she's got these kind of skills. Sewing was women's work, so much so that work and sewing were synonymous. So you're looking at the contents of a work basket there on the left. That's like a sewing basket. So all the things that you would need to do your sewing and mending. And on the right is a work table, which is a sewing table for women. So a specialized piece of furniture just for women that they could keep all their sewing gear in. So it was generally women's duty to keep their household clothed. So things like sheets, towels, diapers, things like that. And then kind of the basic garments of the house. So for a woman, this might, and often did include her own undergarments. This is a shift here on the end, or a chemise. And this is like the basic undergarment layer. So if you picture the fancy dresses of the era, they're generally not something you can throw in a wash tub and like scrub the heck out of. So the principle is you wear this chemise closest to your skin. It's going to absorb all the sweat and oil and everything. And generally you'd want to change it every day, just like changing your underwear today. And this thing of linen or cotton, that could stand a nice scalding and scrubbing on wash day. Women also often made their kids' clothes. So until the age of about 3 or 4, all small children were often dressed in dresses, and they were often white or kind of a buff colored cotton or linen. And from a 21st century perspective, it seems like the worst possible choice to put like messy little kids in white clothes. In the 19th century, it was the most practical because the clothing that was dyed, that could fade in the wash. The colors weren't nearly as color fast as our synthetic dyes are today. But a white thing, again, is something you can really put in that scalding water and scrub with that harsh lye soap, and you have the best chance of keeping clean in the long run. And then finally, women would often make their husbands at least their shirts. If you're a rural family, the wife might make the husband's entire, outfit. If you're an urban family, the man's probably seeing a tailor for, a nice fit for a suit of clothes, but the wife is probably making his shirts. And what you see here is that there's kind of like a boxy construction to most of these. It's basically just joining rectangles together and then embellishing them. So considering these universal sewing skills that all women have, it's something that would be like well within their range of ability to accomplish. So when it came to making their own outer garments, women had two choices, and they generally availed themselves of both, or even sometimes a hybrid. They could make their own dresses, and garments dresses is a typo I see there, sorry, or they could hire a dressmaker to make garments for them. So the dress on the left was made by Susanna Watson, and she, I believe, lived in Maconda, so not that far from here, actually. And she lived on a farm, and she raised the wool that went into the dress. She carded it, she spun it, she dyed it, and she made that dress. And if you were to see it in person, first of all, you'd notice that it's got a very like coarse texture. And second, she was a competent seamstress, but she wasn't going to be like creating anything for a Paris runway. When you get up close to it, you can see that like the collar's a little bit like askew. She didn't like line up the buttons that well. She wasn't ready to start her own business, but she made herself a nice, sturdy, serviceable garment. The other garment, the brown dress, belonged to a woman named Elizabeth Graham. Her father was a farmer. She lived in Logan County. They were kind of like maybe like we'd call them lower middle class today. They weren't super affluent, but she did hire a professional dressmaker to make this dress because it was her wedding dress. And of course, at the time, some women did wear white dresses because they were inspired by Queen Victoria, who wore a white wedding dress when she married Prince Albert. But it was also super common to wear like a nice dress and a dress that you could get a lot of wear out, you know. So Elizabeth would wear this dress for her wedding, and then it would be her Sunday dress for, you know, as long as she could still fit into it, I guess. And so she hired this local dressmaker who was skilled enough to get the very tight fit on the bodice and to handle all the pleats and the ruching and the ruffles and all the ornaments that went on that very elaborate garment. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. She did, yes. I skipped that part. Yes, and so this is linsey woolsey. So it was wool mixed with. Originally, it would have been linen. I think she actually used cotton, and they still called it linsey woolsey. But yes, she did everything, start to finish. So dressmakers were a kind of elite subset of like female employment in the 19th century. It was actually kind of the best gig that you could get as a 19th century woman, especially before the Civil War. There's not a whole lot of options for employment. You could take in washing, you could be a domestic servant, you could take in sewing, which is different than being a dressmaker, or you could work in a factory. None of that is really like easy labor that gives you a lot of agency. Dressmaking, you did have that chance to establish yourself. You got to choose your own client. Your clients treated you kind of like as a professional and not like sort of a second class citizen like domestic servants might have been treated. If you were successful enough, you could open your own shop and have employees of your own, and it paid pretty highly. So dressmaking was an option for women who were really good with a needle and perhaps were widowed and needed to support themselves, or maybe even, you know, wanted to be independent in their lives. The contrast is with taking and sewing. And so remember how I said that sewing was a universal skill that all women had? It was so universal that sewing was considered unskilled labor in the 19th century. And so a woman who took in sewing was kind of a contract laborer who would be employed by like a merchant tailor kind of operation. And she would pick up pre cut bundles of fabric. She would take them home and sew them and press them and return them to the, you know, to the tailor who had hired her and be paid very, very little for it. And the women who did this tended to be women who had been, you know, like abandoned or widowed by a husband who had small kids at home, because it was something that you could do at home, you know, with your kids. If you've got kids at home, the option of going off to a factory is kind of like closed off to you. So, how do people make clothes? The inspiration came from ladies' magazines, and Paris and London were kind of at the center of the creative heart of 19th century fashion. And especially Paris was putting out beautiful colored illustrations of what was fashionable. And those illustrations were grabbed up by American publishers like Mr. Godey or Mr. Peterson, and he had his artists, they had their artists copy them for their own publications because copyright laws were a lot more loosey goosey in those days. So women would be able to buy a magazine that would have these beautiful colored fashion illustrations in them. And the magazines themselves were pretty accessible. They weren't that expensive. They were able to be mailed all over the country. So whether you lived in the city or country or whatever, you could get your hands on a Godey's magazine. And so when you're looking at this beautiful illustration, this is not to say that all women in 1864 were going around dressed like this. Think of this as kind of like an editorial spread in Vogue, where this is like the height of fashion, the most embellishment. And women of the time would kind of be looking at this and they'd have a sense of what was already fashionable, and they'd be looking at this to see kind of what was different this season. So maybe we're wearing these, you know, long vertical panels on our skirt, or maybe sleeves are coming down to the elbow now or something like that. And they would keep that in mind. And most likely what they would do would be to go to an existing dress that they had and refresh the trimming on it, you know, like change the bows or change the placement of the embellishment embellishment or even like tweak the cut a little bit. So an old dress looked fashionable. Most women, if they were doing okay, if they were kind of middle class, might have like a new dress once or twice a year, but definitely people's wardrobes were nowhere near the size that ours were. I've been asked how many clothes a woman might have owned in the 19th century, and it's kind of all over the board. If you were very poor, you might have, the clothes on your back or your church dress and your other dress. When Mary Lincoln hit the White House, she ordered 17 dresses made for herself. But generally, I think most women had about, I don't know, like somewhere in the neighborhood of like 6 to 10, individual garments that they owned. So sizes and commercial patterns became available by the 1880s. They actually started getting out there in the 1860s, but they weren't sized. They were just kind of like general guidelines that you'd have to size yourself. By the 1880s, you did have these sized patterns, and so you've got kind of this opening up of magazine availability. You've got growing transportation networks to get this information out to people. And so fashion becomes a lot more democratic at this point because anyone with those kind of, base level sewing skills could now order any pattern that their hearts desired from the pattern catalog and take a stab at it at home. And I brought this blue bodice, which is up here. I hope you'll come take a look at it after the talk to check out. I suspect that this is a home sewer who had a pattern and tried a bodice. And a bodice like that is kind of challenging because it's very tight, it requires a precise fit. And she had some success. When you look at the buttons, you see they don't line up quite right at the bottom. They're kind of squished together, so there's like a fabric sticking out. So she did her best. I wouldn't call her a professional. I think she's probably a home sewer with a pattern. Most women actually used their own garments as a pattern for their dresses. Sewing machines became available in the 1850s and were commonplace in homes after the Civil War. So the early models of sewing machines were very heavy and they tended to be very expensive, and it was mainly like professional tailors who were buying them. After the Civil War, the price went down, they got a little bit more streamlined. It got so, if a part broke, you could get that part. They were a little more interchangeable. And also the sewing machine companies did a huge marketing push to get them into homes. So they would advertise them on layaway or have specials that made them more enticing to women. So by 1860s, 1870s, you see them in middle class homes. And by the end of the 19th century, they're in homes kind of up and down the economic spectrum. So in one sense, the sewing machine is a huge game changer because it's really a time saver. A shirt that would have taken 10 hours to make by hand, you can now make in an hour and a half. It really does speed things up. On the other hand, especially right when sewing machines kind of hit the market and became popular, fashion tended to move the goalposts for women. So in the 1870s, they had a burst of very ornate fashion. These bustle dresses with all the ribbons and all the lace and all the whatever. And it's almost like, all the time that you would have saved constructing the garment now got eaten up to make it fancy like that. So another question for the crowd. How much time have you invested in the clothes that you're wearing? Does anyone want to give an estimate? Just any time that you invested in them, whatever. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I would say, it took me maybe 10 minutes to gather up the laundry and throw it in the machine, another, 5 to go move it over, another 10 to fold all the laundry, everything included. And then I spent about 2 minutes ironing my top because it was all wrinkled this morning. So that's about it. In the 19th and most of the 20th centuries, there's a vast investment in labor for clothing, mending it, remaking it, washing it, and then extending the life of the fabric when the clothing was done. And here I just wanted to share this artifact. This is a woman's sewing basket from 1889, and it comes with exactly the things that this woman was using. And I love it because it also has a like little clipped poem from a newspaper or magazine. And imagine just kind of like how we might put something up on the fridge, or post something up on a desktop by a computer. That was probably the equivalent for her, that this is a basket that she's going to every day, probably multiple times a day. And so seeing this poem was probably like a little boost for her. So mending clothing is one of the earliest skills taught to women and little girls. I love this image because it shows the generational nature of sewing. That this little girl is literally learning at what's probably her grandmother's feet. She's probably sewing clothes for her little dolly down there, and when she gets good enough at that, she's going to be helping mom with mending things in the house. And it also shows the lifelong nature of sewing. It's something that you pick up as a small child, and as long as your eyesight holds out, a woman could expect to do it basically the rest of her life. So these are some of the most common methods of mending clothing. We have your standard patch, which is inserting another piece of fabric over a hole to kind of close the gap here. And it's interesting to me to think about the nature of patched clothes in the 19th century. The price of our clothes has come down to such a degree, and we have so many clothes that, in my case, if a shirt rips, then I like put it aside, and it's like, oh, I'll fix that someday. But I like in the meantime, I have like 30 other shirts that I can wear, so it kind of gets like phased out of rotation. In the 19th century, when people had many, many fewer clothes, and there was so much labor and expense invested in them. You had to keep everything patched. And they also lived a lot more like physical lives than we do. They're out walking everywhere, riding horses, or doing physical labor just for kind of basic everyday tasks, and wearing out their clothes a lot faster than we do. So this is one of my favorite artifacts that exists in the world. I wish to God that we had it at the Illinois State Museum, but alas, this is in England somewhere, and it was actually like found in a working man's cottage that dates to the 1820s. It was stuffed up a chimney, maybe to plug a draft at some point. But I love it because, I mean, look at those patches. This is a garment that is soiled and stained and has been torn and mended on top of mended. And this just shows, what a world without an abundance of fabric and textiles looks like. This might have been this man's only pair of pants, and he had to just keep them going to keep himself clothed and, able to go out to work with pants on. That's not to say that it was only working people who patched their clothes. This is a gentleman's coat, and you can see in this close up of the elbow, he's worn through his elbows and has a little hole that's been patched. Looks like actually on both sides there. And this is Thomas Jefferson's greatcoat that he wore in the year 1800. So, President of the United States has mended clothes. Really, no one is accepted from the necessity of mending clothes. So, if we were to zap back in time 150 years, I have no doubt that just walking down the street, most of the people we'd see would have like patches or mending or, darning on them somewhere. It was just a fact of life. That patching and mending and darning was part of creating this sort of like respectable veneer to the public. And so this is an image of a family that was painted, I think, somewhere around the year 1840. And I love it because this to me is like a 19th century housewife who's got her Instagram filter on and is showing her best self to the world. The house is clean, the kids are well behaved, the kids are in clean clothes, when I'm sure, walk in there in any day to day life and the kids were probably screaming and their clothes were stained and everything. She was probably a normal human woman. But this is the ideal that we're shooting for. And especially, the well maintained, well presented clothes is part of this promise of America, that you come over to this country where we don't have a king, we're a democracy, and anyone who works hard and kind of um, tries to be, gentlemanly, can rise through the ranks. And part of that is, maintaining this presentable wardrobe that includes washing your clothes, mending your clothes. So a lot of that is like, burden that falls on the women. We think about the man who's got his job and he's earning money from the household, but the woman's kind of doing her part by doing all these domestic tasks that are kind of like helping to, raise or maintain the family's social cachet. On the other side of the token, if you're not keeping up with the mending of the clothes, this is also a signal, but it's a signal that, like, something's off and it's a little bit suspicious. So this is a painting in 1894 of a little gang of street toughs in New York. And at this point, they're kids, so we could kind of label them mischievous kids. But still, there's an element of like disorder and unease about them. There's that one person who's like clutching the child to them in the background. And you get the sense that if these kids aren't reined in, they're kind of running wild with no direction, like then they're going to grow up to be adults who are kind of running wild and causing chaos, which is a little more threatening to the social order. And a lot of these kids have ragged clothes. And so the immediate signal to the viewer is that like no one's looking after these kids, like where's their mom and who's providing them like moral direction and instruction and keeping them off the streets and doing something productive. And in the absence of that kind of guidance, their clothes are falling apart, their, behavior is starting to be questionable. So again, those women and the influence, the kind of civilizing and mending influence is not just mending clothing, it's also kind of like mending the social structure and keeping everyone in check. So mending is a job that anyone did, rich or poor. Really, you couldn't really expect to get away from it if you were a 19th century American woman. This is a time in life when a lot of middle class women had domestic servants. You had a couple waves of immigration. Before the Civil War, there was a wave of Irish and German immigrants. After the Civil War, towards the later part of the 19th century, you had a wave of more Eastern and Southern European immigrants. This creates a big labor pool. This means that you could hire someone to work in your house as a domestic servant for a reasonable amount of money. It's also a time before electricity and running water, when running a household is a lot of physical labor. There's water to haul, there's ashes to haul, there's a big coal burning or wood burning stove to tend. But even if you did employ a domestic servant, it's not like Downton Abbey in America. It's not like an upstairs, downstairs where the housekeeper is living a life of leisure and the servant is doing all the work. It's more like a division of labor where the wife is taking care of some things and the servant is taking care of other things. But if you're the employer, you do get to, choose. You get to choose what you do and what you're going to delegate. And most women would choose to do the sewing and mending themselves, because if it's a choice between that and, cooking or scrubbing the dishes or cleaning out the fireplaces, the sewing is the one that you can do in your parlor, while someone reads aloud to you. It's a little more like, light labor, but it is still labor and it's still getting done, and one must still do it. This is a bodice that I also brought. It's also up top here. And I like this one because this belonged to a very well-off woman. Her name was Isabel Flagg. She's there in the picture. Her father-in-law was the Secretary of State of Illinois in the 1860s. This is a very lovely, probably silk bodice that she has, and she has mended it. There's a patch under the arm here. So even though, it's a fancy garment, still mended, and she would have still worn this out and considered it a nice dress. And what's really fun about this is we have about a half a dozen garments from Isabel that came to us, and every single one of them has a patch in the exact same spot. So I think there was probably something about, the way her corset fit and the way she moved her arm, that she just rubbed a hole into every single garment she owned. And she'd probably be mortified if she knew that we knew that about her. And then on to darning. Has anyone here darn? Does anyone know how to darn? Does anyone darn on a regular basis? It is, yeah, it's definitely a skill that's fallen by the wayside. Darning is basically when you take a knit and you're essentially reweaving it. So you would take that instrument, there's a black darning egg here, I've got a darning mushroom, and you would put it inside the toe of a sock and you would open up the hole and you'd take your thread and go one way and then go back and over under, so you'd reweave it. These are actually Isabel's socks here, so come check them out. And I love those because these are darned to heck. The toes have been like darned on top of darned. And I thought, like, these must be her favorite socks because she really went to a lot of trouble to like keep these going and keep them in rotation. And it also shows, just how quickly and how hard people use their clothes and they got worn through. And I've given this talk before where people remember wearing, darn socks in their youth, and they said, oh, it really matters, like the quality of thread you use and how good someone is. If they did a bad job or with really like lumpy thread, then you would feel it under your foot, like it just didn't feel nice. Okay, moving on to making over clothing. There are very few who do not renovate and make over their old dresses when they have grown too old-fashioned to be presentable. So making over is the act of basically taking something apart and refashioning it, or taking the decorations off of it and retrimming it so it's freshened up, but it's not like a from scratch new garment. And if anyone has read Little Women, and you remember when Meg has her blue dress that she said was freshly turned and trimmed, so it felt like a new dress, but it wasn't. It was her same old dress. So one way to make over a garment is to make it over for a child. And if you picture a husband who's worn through the knees of his pants, those could easily be cut down and turned into pants for a son. Or a wife who's got a skirt that has 8 yards of fabric and a lot of it might be faded or soiled in some way, but somewhere in those 8 yards is another couple good yards that you could turn into a dress for a child. You might also piece together scraps of fabric. And this is a winter petticoat. It's quilted with wool inside, and you're looking at the underside. So I flipped it inside out. If you were to flip it right side out, it's all the same fabric on the outside. But inside, you can see there's at least 3, there might be 4 different styles of fabric in there. And so these might have been salvaged from old garments that were cut apart, or these might be scraps from the work basket left over from making clothes. But whatever the case, they were, they weren't cast aside. They were fashioned into something useful. If you're going to make over clothing, or if you're going to put a dress through hard wear, you tended to want to go with like a dark colored calico. These were very forgiving in terms of getting stained and soiled. The dark would hide it pretty well. And also the small figure was more forgiving if you did have to cut it apart. If you're going to cut it apart and make something new and reassemble it, it's much easier to get a small pattern back together than a larger one. And you might even just take something apart, save the fabric because it's really nice fabric, and turn it into a project 30 years later, which is what happened with this dress. I've got the top and the sleeves here. And this dress started life in the 1860s, so a classic, Civil War era hoop skirt. And we know that because the very center of the bodice still has its 1860s kind of shape. It's got this sloped shoulders, those little darts at the bottom are very classically 1860s. But along the way, someone got a hold of it and started to remake it in the 1890s. They slimmed down the skirt, so it went from bell shape to more of an A-line. And they also made these very poofy sleeves that were popular in the middle of the 1890s. But for whatever reason, they stopped there. They didn't finish with the bodice. They didn't attach the sleeves. So what we have is this like construction project right in progress. But I love it because it shows, the way that women did remake their clothes even over a span of decades. And so we're going to talk about washing for a bit. There was a rise in the frequency that people washed their clothing in the 19th century. And so you've got this confluence of, you've got like what we talked about, a young America where it's possible for people to kind of rise up through the social ranks with enough hard work, and if they pay attention to the correct etiquette, and part of that being the correct presentation, right? So there's something to be gained from maintaining a neat and clean appearance. And you've also got this happening at the same time as the second great awakening, so there's some like morality overlaid in it. And the phrase cleanliness is next to godliness comes during this era where you've got this idea that, clean people are like good and prosperous, and people who are, impoverished are dirty, or are they dirty because they're impoverished, or which way. But there's definitely like a impetus to keep yourself and your clothes clean. And who does this burden fall on? Washing is a woman's task. And so I'll skip to how hard washing was first. Washing was considered the great domestic dread of the household. It was, if anyone's ever hauled a bucket of water, it's heavy. Standing over a boiling kettle in the backyard is hot work. It's endless. Most people had multiple loads of laundry that they had to get through in a day. They would use lye soap, which was very caustic and hard on their hands. There's one woman's diary from the 1860s where she talks about using the lye soap on Monday, and then it would kind of rubbed her hands raw. And just as her hands were starting to heal at the end of the week, like wash day would roll around again, and it was time to do it all over again. This was Catherine Beecher's laying out all the steps for washing, and these are all the implements that one would use for washing. So it involved sorting and soaking clothes, washing, wringing out, scrubbing, boiling, rubbing the dirty spots, rinsing again. If they're white garments, you might run them through some bluing, and the bluing would counteract the yellowing and make the whites kind of brighter. If they were like a shirt or a petticoat, you might also run them through dip them in a starch. And so, yeah, and then repeat the process for each load. So, this would kill your Monday every single week. Going back, I wanted to show you some laundry marks, because these are some of my favorite aspects of historic clothing. The laundry mark is when you write someone's name on their garment, either with indelible ink. Some women had stencils, some women embroidered it, but it serves the same function as when you send a kid to summer camp and you write their name in their underpants with a Sharpie. It's to make sure that the right garment goes to the right person. If you imagine a household where there's mom and four daughters and everyone's throwing their petticoat in the wash, like, you got to make sure that everyone gets the right thing back. So washing clothing is such a bummer that it was kind of like an understood joke. Like, everyone knew that washing was the worst. So this is a ballad that was popular. It was first printed in the 1830s and was still floating around in the 1850s. It's called A Ballad for Wet Weather, and it's kind of like a comic ballad. So the gist of it is, I'll read. I'm not going to sing. I don't know the tune, and I wouldn't subject you to that even if I did. But my Kate, she is a bonny wife, there's none so free from evil, unless upon a washing day, and then she is the devil. I met a friend who asked of me, how long's poor Kate been dead, lamenting the good creature gone, and sorry I was wed to such a scolding vixen while he had been far away. The truth was, he chanced to come upon a washing day. So in essence, the visitor comes and sees this man's ill-tempered wife and thinks like, oh, I remember his wife was really sweet. She must have died and he must have remarried the shrew here. And nope, it's still Kate. It's just wash day and she's in a terrible mood. So if you had any disposable income as a housekeeper, hiring out the laundry was usually the first thing that you did. Even if you couldn't afford a domestic servant to come into your house, you might hire someone who would either pick up your laundry and do it in their own house and bring it back, or they would come to your house and kind of use your equipment and do your laundry in your home. And so washing clothing as a profession for women was something that, again, women who had small kids at home could do. They could take in laundry and then be working at home and being able to keep an eye on their kids. It's often something that Black women and immigrant women did, and it was very hard physical labor. Although there were some advantages to it that made it, kind of preferable to some other situations. Probably the most um, advantageous part about it was that there was a lot of agency to it. If you went from house to house, you could choose who your clients were, and if someone wasn't treating you right, you just didn't have to do their laundry. Or if you took laundry into your home, you could be working at your own pace the way you wanted to without someone hanging over your shoulder. If you're a domestic servant, on the other hand, you're usually living in someone's house and you're basically on call 24 hours a day. You don't really have a place to call your own, and someone's always like telling you exactly how they want things done. So the last thing is to think about, what will you do with your clothes you're wearing when you no longer want them? Donate them to Goodwill. Yeah, that's pretty standard. Awesome. That's great. My husband does that too. He spilled on a t-shirt and he said his first thought was, "Oh no, my t-shirt." And then he thought, "Oh boy, a new rag to clean with." So this shows my 21st century bias, because I'm saying, what will you do with the clothes, assuming that you won't want them? If it was 100 years ago and you had a garment that had worn out, you might just pack it away in a trunk and save it because it was yours, you wore it, someone else might need it someday. But for us, we kind of tend to cycle through clothes. Like the clothes that we have in our closets today are by and large not the same ones that were there like 15 years ago. Things, fashions change, sizes change, our inclinations change. If we were in the 19th century, we would recycle those clothes because the textiles were valuable, and we would be very mindful of just how much labor we had put into them. So one of the most basic things is to cut it up into rags, cut it up into smaller pieces that could be made into like a doll or a sewing kit like this. Just make something new out of it. One might also save your rags and give it to the rag man. Again, the Little Women reference. Amy needed limes for her school, but it wasn't her turn for the rag money that month. And the rag money comes from taking your rags either to the general store or selling them to a peddler who would come and buy them from you. And they're all going back to paper making companies. So in the 19th century, paper was made using a lot of cotton and linen rags. It actually depended on these rags. So these paper making companies had a vested interest in making sure that women were saving their rags and funneling them to the paper companies. And so they would make sure it was worth their while by paying women. And it wasn't a ton of money, but it was enough, for a kid to have a little pocket money, or, to buy a couple things here and there. You might cut it up and make it into a quilt. This is a quilt in the Illinois State Museum's collection that has pieces of suiting from old wool suits sewn together for warmth. You might make it into a rug. So the rag man will take cotton and linen, but he will not take wool. But wool will make an excellent rug. So you could set a kid down and have him cut some old fabric or clothing into strips, and then sew those strips end to end in a ball like that. And then you might braid a rug out of it, or there were, professionals who you could give your rag balls to, and they would weave a rug for you. And then the last part is to talk a little bit about fast fashion, because fast fashion is where we are today. And we got there kind of quick. It happened in my lifetime. I remember being a kid where there would be like back to school shopping, and I'd get, a couple outfits, and that was it. And then maybe when the weather got warm the following year, I might get some summer clothes, and that was it. And the quality, I feel like, was better. People were still using more natural materials, like polyester and synthetics hadn't totally taken hold. And now we're in an era where fashion is often fast. So someone designs it somewhere, and then like 6 months later, it shows up in a store. And having been made that quickly, it's made kind of, um, not with the best care to detail. The materials are often inexpensive, and it usually is made overseas with places with limited labor laws. And so the business model there is quantity, and we're meant to keep buying. And the fashion changes so fast, so we'll go in shopping, and I'm someone who shops my feelings. So I do this, go in and like, oh, that's cute, and oh, do I really need this new top? Well, it's only $15, sure, and I take it home, and a lot of the time the clothes that we buy as Americans like goes into a landfill. We really don't like use a lot of it, or if I spill something on it, I'm like, well, no big loss, it was only $15, I'll just buy another shirt now. So we're meant to be continually shopping and spending often, making low dollar purchases but frequently, to kind of keep the fashion industry going. It's not great for the environment. Rivers in Asia are not super healthy because of all the dyeing wastewater that goes into them. The polyester is putting a lot of microplastics in the ocean. I just saw an article on CNN that said like microplastics are showing up in human brains now. And then there's just a lot thrown away. We're not invested in these clothes that we literally have not invested time or a whole lot of money into. So it's a lot easier just to throw it away. I do it with my son's socks. If he gets a hole in his sock, I'll just buy him a new pack at Target rather than try to fix a kitty sock. Um, Especially my son's underwear. Like, what do you do with a kid's underwear? Like, I don't want anyone having that, and nobody wants it. So, that goes in the garbage too. And that's just kind of where we are in life. And then fast fashion is hard on garment workers. The reason that clothing production is sourced to other countries is because other countries are um, will turn a blind eye to unsafe conditions and low wages and things like that. So that shirt that I bought for $15 is that cheap because somewhere in the world someone really didn't get paid a living wage to make it. So we're kind of caught in this cycle. If I decided tomorrow, like, what, this isn't healthy for the environment or people, I'm going to start making my own clothes. A, I don't have the skills anymore because I don't know how to sew, and B, that would be a whole lot more expensive in terms of like time and money. To go to a store and buy the fabric, buy the pattern, and buy the notions is like much more expensive than just buying it off the rack. So we are like, for all intents and purposes, we're mainly consumers of clothes now. So if we want to, lighten the impact of living in a world of fast fashion, some things that we can do are to buy less, like for me, resisting that impulse to buy my feelings and say, no, I really don't need this shirt right now. Choose things that are better made or kind of more like classic styles that'll still be in fashion. And then, yeah, make it last if we want to go the extra mile and start mending. So here are some final things to think about. How has shopping for clothing changed in your lifetime? How is the shopping experience different for you than it was for your parents? How has caring for clothing changed in your lifetime? And how has your attitude about clothing changed in your lifetime? So with that, this is the end of my talk. I would love to hear either your thoughts on any of these questions, or if anyone has any stories about making or mending clothes from yourself or your family. Now is just kind of our time to talk. Yeah, interesting question. I imagine that they made their own clothes. When we picture servants, we often picture them in uniforms, and that was kind of a later 19th century thing. Before the Civil War, servants would just wear work dresses that I think they had on their own. And there are like cartoons in some magazines like Harper's Weekly that show servants who are dressed up on their day off to go to church or something, and they're wearing very fancy clothes, and the like lady of the house doesn't like that at all because they think the servants forgetting their place. So that their nice dresses would be something they made themselves. When we get into the uniform era, I wonder if that's something that was like distributed by an employer. Yes.
happen to know if there's much effort on, at least in America, on scaling back on the amount of clothing and the varieties with clothing manufacturers so that there's not overabundance? I mean, that when I saw that, I forgot what the
21 billion tons, yeah.
trousers are started every year, and I'm hoping that that means that's after anyone who needs clothing has, some clothing to wear.
Right, yeah.
Still, I mean,
I don't think it's certainly not like a, national awareness to the part where like plastic, we're all like, oh, we should recycle plastic, and you go to a public place and there's often like the recycle bin and the trash bin. Like that's kind of become general. We're nowhere near that with textiles, and like individual communities will sometimes have a textile donation thing or a drop off. And in terms of reducing the number of clothing bought, I think capitalism is winning there. It's a big business, and there people have a lot of money at stake and selling a lot of clothes. So I think that's kind of churning along. That's true. Right. Yes. Yes. Yes, that's an excellent point. So like in, our lifetime starting in the 20th century, we went from like people making their own clothes, to like the rise of the mall, and kind of like there was sort of a turn away from homemade clothes. It's like, oh, like I want this brand instead. And then the mall has declined, and now the internet has risen. But side by side with the fast fashion is the internet has allowed for these niche companies where people do, make things out of recycled fabrics, or I've seen, things made out of like they take the ocean plastic and recycle it and turn it into shoes and things like that, or companies that strive very hard to, do fair trade and be eco-friendly and all that. The thing is that's usually expensive, so it's if you want to be kind of eco-conscious or, like labor conscious, you have to pay for the privilege. It's not like an across the board thing.
the designer who does bleaching, like putting it in all kinds of stuff. And one pair
Holy moly. Right, yeah, exactly.
but she sells
Wow.
she has jackets
Wow.
and blue jeans and
Huh?
very expensive. Personal experiences. I was growing up, washed delicates in woolite.
Oh
And
yeah, I
it's
remember
just been
Woolite.
within the last 5 years that I've thought, I don't know if there's anything to that woolite thing, and I just don't put detergent on them, and
I
I can't tell any
know.
difference. I don't know. But that's just it. Just occurred to me when you were talking about washing that.
You use Woolite. Well, our clothes have gotten a lot easier to care for. I feel like I had a lot more dry clean only things, 20 years ago, or things that needed special care. And I'm maybe took it one step worse than you. I've stopped sorting my clothes. I think like I'll just put them in on warm and it'll all turn out okay.
I'm one of the last ironers.
That's
yeah.
Yeah, you do.
I had some girlfriends who went through a phase private.
Oh my gosh, how'd that work out? Okay. Yeah.
That could be a trend.
Yes, we should start it. Yes, no new clothes for a year. That's great. Wow.
But, how many the 70s, the late to mid 70s, my mom still did the laundry. We had someone do the ironing.
Really?
To someone.
Wow. That's cool. Yeah, I can remember my mom would, she'd have the spray starch and she'd do my dad's shirts. And when I got married, I remember she did a couple of my husband's, and he said, "Boy, nobody irons a shirt like your mom. Like, I wish she'd iron more of my clothes. Why can't you iron like that?"
Suits every day. He had umpteen white shirts, and I can remember he had I think it was like a soda bottle, and then it had a
Oh,
cap,
yep.
a sprinkler that would go into it. I can remember her dousing my granddad's
Yeah,
shirts and
yeah.
rubbing it up, and then yeah, I don't know, I don't remember that part. But yeah, well, then they're kept.
Huh.
At least they're done.
Wow.
And then when you get them out, I love that.
So then you unroll them and they're okay?
And then they were ironed.
Oh, gotcha. I see. Huh. Cool. Neat.
We're talking about sewing. So I grew up when here. Always had
Oh, yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, please come up and look at the clothing up here on the counter here. Sure, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.